Good day. Today, we examine one of the darkest chapters in human history, a period when the medical profession, which is supposed to heal, became an instrument of systematic murder. We are talking about the Nazi medical experiments conducted during the Holocaust, most infamously by Josef Mengele, a doctor known as the Angel of Death. This is not an easy story to tell. It involves the suffering and death of hundreds of thousands of people, many of them children. But it is a story that must be told. It is a story that changed medical ethics forever. It is a story that revealed what human beings are capable of doing to other human beings when ideology supersedes humanity and when doctors abandon their ethical obligations. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the profound tragedy at the heart of this history. The victims of these experiments were real people, men, women, and children who suffered unimaginable pain. Many died. Many who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. This documentary honors their memory and the truth of their experiences. Over the next 40 minutes, we will examine the ideology that made these experiments possible, the individuals who conducted them, the specific experiments that were performed, and the legal and ethical consequences that emerged after the war. We will see how these atrocities led to the creation of modern medical ethics, and we will reflect on the lessons that this dark history holds for us today. Let us begin by understanding the ideological context that made medical experimentation on human beings possible. The Nazi Party, which came to power in Germany in 1933, was built on a foundation of racial ideology. The Nazis believed that human beings could be categorized into racial hierarchies, with the Aryan race at the top and other groups, particularly Jews, Roma, Slavic peoples, and disabled individuals, at the bottom. This ideology was not original to the Nazis. Racial thinking had emerged in the 19th century in Europe and America, but the Nazis took this ideology to unprecedented extremes. Central to Nazi ideology was the concept of eugenics, the idea that society could be improved by eliminating those deemed biologically unfit. Eugenics had been a mainstream scientific movement in the early 20th century, with proponents in the United States, Scandinavia, and other Western countries. But in Nazi Germany, eugenics became state policy. In 1933, just months after Hitler came to power, the Nazi government passed the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, commonly called the Hereditary Health Law. This law authorized the forced sterilization of people deemed to have hereditary diseases or genetic defects. The law affected people with mental illness, physical disabilities, epilepsy, alcoholism, and various other conditions. The implementation of this law was massive. Between 1933 and 1945, approximately 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized in Nazi Germany. Special hereditary health courts were established to determine who would be sterilized. These courts consisted of a panel of physicians and other officials. The decisions were usually routine. Sterilization was almost always approved. Physicians, who were supposed to be healers, served on these courts and approved the sterilizations of their own patients. This mass sterilization program was only the beginning. It revealed that the Nazi government was willing to use the medical profession to pursue its racial goals. It also demonstrated that ordinary physicians, many of them well-trained and educated, would participate in these programs if they believed the state had authorized them. The next escalation came with the euthanasia program. Beginning in the mid-1930s, the Nazi government began systematically killing people it deemed unfit to live. The targets included people with mental illness, severe physical disabilities, and other conditions. The euthanasia program was not well publicized. It operated in secrecy, but gradually people began to realize what was happening. The euthanasia program killed approximately 250,000 people before it was officially halted in 1941 due to public pressure and protests from church leaders. But the killing did not stop. It simply continued without official sanction. And the experience gained in carrying out euthanasia proved valuable when the Nazis began implementing their final solution, the systematic murder of all European Jews. This ideological context is crucial for understanding the medical experiments. The experiments were not conducted by rogue doctors acting against official policy. They were conducted within a system that had already accepted the idea that certain groups of people could be killed for the greater good of society or for the advancement of science. Now let us examine the most notorious figure in this dark history, Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele was born in 1911 in Günzburg, Germany, into a prosperous middle-class family. He studied medicine and earned both his MD and his PhD degrees. He was intellectually capable and ambitious. He published scientific papers. By all accounts, he was a promising young physician. In the late 1930s, Mengele became interested in the study of genetics and heredity. He became an assistant to a noted researcher named Ottmar Verschuer at the Institute for Heredity Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. Verschuer was one of Germany's leading geneticists and a strong proponent of racial hygiene, the Nazi term for eugenics. Under Verschuer's mentorship, Mengele became interested in the study of twins. He believed that twins could provide valuable insights into the relative importance of heredity versus environment in determining human characteristics. When World War II began, Mengele served as a physician in the German army, but his real opportunity came in 1943 when he was assigned to Auschwitz, the largest Nazi concentration camp. Mengele's assignment to Auschwitz was likely arranged by his mentor Verschuer, who wanted access to research subjects for his genetic studies. At Auschwitz, Mengele would have unlimited access to human subjects for his experiments, and he would face no meaningful oversight or consequences if his subjects died. Upon his arrival at Auschwitz in May 1943, Mengele began his work. His primary interest was the study of twins. When new prisoners arrived at the camp, Mengele would examine them, looking for sets of twins. When he identified twins, he would separate them from their families and place them in a special barracks. He also looked for individuals with unusual physical characteristics, dwarfs, people with unusual eye colors or other anomalies who might be of scientific interest. Mengele was not the only doctor at Auschwitz conducting experiments. There were over 30 SS medical personnel at Auschwitz who participated in various forms of medical experimentation. These doctors included Karl Klauberg, who conducted sterilization experiments, Horst Schumann, who gassed people with disabilities, and others, but Mengele was the most prolific and became the most infamous. The experiments that Mengele conducted on twins are the most well documented. According to survivor accounts and historical records, Mengele's research focused on the genetics of twins and the possibility of increasing the number of twins in the German population. This was, in Mengele's mind, a way to improve the German racial stock. The procedures that Mengele inflicted on his twin subjects were horrifying. He subjected the twins to every imaginable type of examination and testing. He took extensive body measurements, photographed them, made plaster casts of their teeth and jaws, and took fingerprints and footprints. He drew large amounts of blood from the twins repeatedly. He injected them with various substances, sometimes causing infections. In one type of experiment, Mengele attempted to change the eye color of twins by injecting chemical substances directly into their eyes. The chemical substance, possibly methylene blue, would cause severe pain and swelling. Some children went blind as a result. Some died. The objective was to understand whether eye color could be altered, and if so, whether this could be used to create more blue-eyed, supposedly more Aryan individuals. In another experiment, Mengele injected twins with bacteria that cause Noma disease, a serious infection of the mouth and genital areas that causes severe boils and often becomes gangrenous. According to survivor accounts, Over 100 twins were infected with Noma disease in a single experiment. Many became seriously ill, some died. Mengele also performed surgeries without anesthetics on the twins. He removed organs, performed transfusions, and conducted other surgical procedures. All of these procedures were conducted without consent, without pain relief, and often without medical necessity. One survivor, Vera Kriegel, who was subjected to Mengele's experiments as a child, later recalled walking into Mengele's laboratory and seeing a wall lined with preserved human eyes, a collection that resembled butterflies in a display case. These eyes had been removed from people, presumably other experimental subjects. The psychological impact on Vera, seeing this grotesque display of human remains, was profound and lasting. Perhaps the most horrible aspect of Mengele's experiments was what he did when they concluded. Once he had collected all the data he wanted from a pair of twins, all the measurements, blood samples, and other information, he would murder them. The method was typically a lethal injection of chloroform to the heart. Then he would perform autopsies on the bodies, dissecting them to examine their internal organs. He would compare the organs of twins to each other, looking for differences and similarities that might illuminate his research interests. According to historical research, Mengele conducted experiments on approximately 1,000 pairs of twins, roughly 2,000 individual children. Of these, only about 200 pairs survived. The vast majority were murdered. Among these child victims were Roma children. Roma people were viewed by the Nazis as racially inferior and were subjected to severe persecution. Many Roma children were sent to Auschwitz and subjected to Mengele's experiments. Almost none of the Roma twins survived. Mengele's work was not conducted in isolation. He sent organs, body parts, skeletons, blood, and other biological specimens to his mentor Verschuer in Germany, who was using them for his own research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Verschuer's institute was one of Germany's leading research institutions, and it participated actively in the collection and study of biological materials taken from camp prisoners. This connection demonstrates that Mengele's experiments were not the work of a lone madman, but rather part of a broader network of research and institutional structures that supported such work. Beyond Mengele's experiments on twins, other doctors at Auschwitz and other camps conducted different types of experiments. Karl Klauberg conducted sterilization experiments primarily on women. He developed a method of injecting caustic substances directly into the uteruses of women without anesthesia. Over the course of 3 to 5 sessions, he would repeatedly inject these substances to cause scarring and block the fallopian tubes. The results were devastating. Many women experienced severe pain, infections, and permanent injuries. About 700 women were successfully sterilized through Klauberg's experiments. Many others died from the infections and complications caused by the procedures. Those women who developed cervical cancer as a result of the experiments were vivisected, their reproductive organs removed surgically while they were still alive, so that Klauberg could study the cancer. Horst Schumann conducted radiation experiments, exposing the reproductive organs of male and female prisoners to lethal doses of radiation in an attempt to develop a method for mass sterilization that would be faster and cheaper than surgical sterilization. Thousands of prisoners were exposed to these radiation experiments. Many suffered severe radiation burns. Many died. Other experiments included studies of infections and diseases. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, typhus, typhoid fever, and other diseases so that researchers could study the progression of disease and test potential treatments. The subjects of these experiments were usually not treated for their infections. They were allowed to suffer and die. There were also experiments related to military medicine. Prisoners were subjected to procedures designed to test treatments for various types of wounds and injuries. Wounds were deliberately inflicted on prisoners, and then various treatments were tested on them without anesthesia. Some experiments were designed to test the effectiveness of drugs and pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceutical companies, including subsidiaries of the major chemical conglomerate IG Farben, used concentration camp prisoners as test subjects for new drugs. The prisoners were forced to take drugs without their knowledge or consent, and the effects were monitored as they developed illnesses and died. In all of these experiments, there was one constant. The subjects had no choice. They did not consent. They could not withdraw, and most of them did not survive. The total number of people subjected to these experiments is difficult to estimate. Some estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of prisoners were subjects of medical experimentation in Nazi concentration camps. Thousands died directly as a result of the experiments. What made this possible? Several factors contributed. First, the victims were people whom the Nazis had already decided to kill anyway. In many cases, the experiments were simply a way to extract some value, scientific value, from people who were slated to die in the gas chambers or from starvation and disease. Second, the victims were completely at the mercy of their captors. They had no rights, no protection, no one to appeal to. They could not refuse. They could not escape. Third, the experiments were conducted within an institutional structure that provided legitimacy and cover. The Nazi government authorized these experiments. The experiments were conducted by physicians with prestigious credentials and connections to major research institutions. This institutional backing made the experiments seem legitimate in the eyes of those conducting them. Fourth, ideology played a crucial role. The researchers believed they were serving a higher purpose, advancing scientific knowledge and improving the German race. This ideological conviction allowed them to overcome normal moral inhibitions against harming human beings. Finally, the medical profession itself failed. The Hippocratic Oath, which physicians have sworn to for over 2,000 years, explicitly forbids harming patients and requires physicians to act in the interests of those under their care. Yet German physicians participated actively in these atrocities. They did not resist. They did not resign. They conducted the experiments or stood by silently while colleagues conducted them. After the war ended in 1945, the Allies faced the question of how to deal with those responsible for these atrocities. At the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted Nazi leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a separate trial was held specifically for doctors. This became known as the Doctors' Trial, or USA versus Brandt, after the leading defendant. 23 German physicians were tried for their role in euthanasia programs and medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The trial lasted from December 1946 to August 1947. It was grueling and difficult. The prosecution had to prove that the defendants had committed crimes against humanity. The defendants, for their part, mounted various defenses. Some argued that they were simply following orders. Others argued that there was no international law forbidding medical experiments on prisoners. Some even argued that their experiments were not significantly worse than experiments that had been conducted in the United States and other countries on prisoners and institutionalized people. The prosecution presented testimony from survivors of the experiments. These survivors described in graphic detail what they had endured. They described pain, suffering, fear, and the loss of friends and family members. Their testimony was emotionally devastating and morally compelling. Ultimately, 16 of the 23 defendants were found guilty. Several were sentenced to death and executed. Others received long prison sentences. But more important than the verdicts was the code of medical ethics that emerged from the trial. In response to the revulsion at the atrocities revealed during the doctor's trial, a set of ethical guidelines for medical experimentation was drafted. This became known as the Nuremberg Code. It was the first international document to establish ethical standards for human subject research. The Nuremberg Code contains 10 principles. The most fundamental is that voluntary and informed consent of research subjects is absolutely necessary. No one can be forced to participate in medical experiments. Subjects must understand what they are being asked to do and must agree to it freely. The code also specifies that experiments should be designed to yield results that benefit humanity, that unnecessary pain and suffering should be avoided, and that subjects should be free to withdraw from an experiment at any time. These principles, which seem obvious to us today, had to be explicitly stated because they had been so thoroughly violated. The Nuremberg Code became the foundation for modern medical research ethics. It is the basis for the informed consent requirements that exist in virtually every country in the world today. It is the reason that every medical experiment must be reviewed by an institutional review board to ensure that subjects are protected. It is the reason that pharmaceutical companies cannot test drugs on unwilling prisoners or vulnerable populations without their consent. In other words, the medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors led directly to the creation of protections that now prevent such atrocities from recurring. The victim's suffering was not in vain. It led to changes that have protected countless people since. What happened to the key figures in this story? Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, escaped capture after the war. He fled to South America, living under assumed names in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. For years, he remained unidentified. In 1985, his remains were discovered in Brazil, identified through forensic analysis. He died in 1979, apparently drowning while swimming, never facing trial for his crimes. This is one of the tragic ironies of the Nazi medical experiment story. The most famous perpetrator, the doctor most victims would recognize, never faced justice. He lived in freedom while his victims suffered from permanent physical and psychological injuries. Ottmar Verschuer, Mengele's mentor, also escaped serious consequences. After the war, he was denazified and allowed to continue his career. He continued to publish scientific papers. Karl Klauberg, who conducted the brutal sterilization experiments, was captured by the Soviet Union and died in a Soviet prison in 1957. Horst Schumann, who conducted the radiation experiments, was captured and served several years in prison, but was eventually released. Many of the perpetrators lived out their lives with relative impunity, never fully facing the consequences of their crimes. This, too, is a tragic aspect of this history, that so many were never prosecuted, and that those who survived the experiments often carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. What are the lessons of this dark chapter of history? First, it demonstrates the dangers of dehumanization. The Nazi doctors could conduct these experiments because they had convinced themselves that their subjects were not fully human, that they were biologically inferior, that they were threats to the racial purity of society. Once people are dehumanized, once they are viewed as less than human, it becomes possible to justify almost any treatment of them. Second, it shows the importance of professional ethics and professional independence. Physicians took an oath, the Hippocratic Oath, that required them to act in the interests of their patients and to do no harm. Yet many German physicians abandoned these principles when pressured by the state. This reveals that professional ethics must be actively defended. They cannot be taken for granted. Third, it demonstrates the danger of ideology taken to extremes. The Nazi ideology of racial superiority was not unique. Similar ideas existed in many countries, including the United States. But it was the extreme form of this ideology, combined with totalitarian power, that led to atrocities. When ideology becomes absolute, when it is used to justify the elimination of people deemed biologically or socially unfit, tremendous danger follows. Fourth, it shows the importance of institutional safeguards and oversight. The Nuremberg Code and modern research ethics exist because of what happened during the Holocaust. Institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, and other protections exist to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Finally, this history reminds us that ordinary people, educated, professional people are capable of committing extraordinary evils if they are placed in circumstances where ideology, institutional authority, and perceived necessity converge. The Nazi doctors were not monsters from mythology. They were educated professionals, some of them brilliant researchers who convinced themselves that they were serving science and society. The victims of these experiments deserve to be remembered. We honor their memory not just by recounting what was done to them, but by ensuring that the world learns from this history. We honor them by supporting medical ethics, by respecting human rights, by resisting dehumanization and ideology taken to extremes. In the decades since the Holocaust, the world has created international frameworks for protecting human rights, for investigating war crimes, and for prosecuting those who commit atrocities. These frameworks are imperfect, but they exist because the world said never again to the horrors of the Nazi era. The medical experiments represent one of the most tragic chapters in this history. They represent the prostitution of medicine, the use of physicians and research to inflict suffering rather than to heal. They represent a complete abandonment of medical ethics and human dignity. But from this tragedy came important lessons. The Nuremberg Code established that human subjects in medical research have rights that must be respected. Today, every medical experiment in the world is supposed to be conducted according to ethical principles that emerged, at least in part, from the horrors revealed during the doctor's trial. In conclusion, the story of Nazi medical experiments is a story of profound evil. It is a story that should disturb and horrify us. But it is also a story that we must remember and understand. Because from our understanding of these past atrocities, we can better prevent similar ones from occurring in the future. The victims, the thousands of men, women, and children who suffered and died in these experiments, deserve to be remembered with dignity and respect. Their suffering, while immeasurable and unforgivable, led to changes that have protected countless people since. This is the tragic legacy of the Nazi medical experiments, a legacy of evil that led to good, of atrocity that inspired change. Thank you for joining me in examining this difficult but important chapter of history.